4 men attacked a millionaire CEO in a restaurant. The waitress's hidden skill reversed the power instantly. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to the main characters. It was a quiet evening at one of Manhattan's finest restaurants. The kind of place where people in suits and ties don't just dine, they make deals. It was supposed to be just another night for Jonathan Hayes, a well-known millionaire CEO. But tonight, something was about to change. Jonathan Hayes, dressed in his usual impeccable suit, sat at his reserved table in the center of the room, tapping his fingers impatiently against the sleek surface of his drink. He was used to waiting for things to happen, used to making things happen. But tonight, his patience was running out. He was here to meet a potential investor, but the man was late. And Jonathan hated being kept waiting. He scrolled through his phone, ignoring the soft murmur of conversations around him, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter from nearby tables. He didn't care about any of that. What he cared about was his time. It was valuable, after all. As he glanced at his watch for the third time in the last 5 minutes, the restaurant door swung open. In walked 4 men, their voices loud enough to catch the attention of everyone in the room. They were dressed in high-end suits, their expensive shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor as they made their way to the bar. Jonathan didn't give them a second thought. But then something caught his eye. One of the men glanced in his direction, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. Jonathan stiffened, instinctively narrowing his eyes. Was this a setup? A subtle challenge? He didn't like it. He didn't like it at all. The group made their way toward him, and before he could say a word, one of them, tall, with a cold stare, spoke. Mr. Hayes, the man said, his tone dripping with condescension. I believe we have a few things to discuss. Jonathan stood up slowly, his hands still gripping the edge of the table. He was used to confrontation, but something about this felt different. The group surrounded him, their presence almost overwhelming. He glanced around the restaurant, noticing the growing tension. A quiet murmur spread through the room, but no one dared to intervene. That's when Emily Parker, the waitress, noticed them. She had been quietly serving another table when she sensed the shift in the air. The CEO's usual calm demeanor was replaced by something else, something more dangerous. She didn't know why, but instinct told her she needed to pay attention. She walked over to their table, her eyes scanning the group of men. As she did, one of them made a move. Without warning, he shoved Jonathan back into his chair. The entire room went silent. Emily was already at the table, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. Jonathan's face was a mask of shock, but his eyes flickered with something more. Anger, perhaps, but also something else. A realization. Emily's calm voice cut through the tension. Please don't get up, sir, she said softly, but with authority. The group froze, their attention turning to her. She wasn't just a waitress. Her next words were like a weapon, precise and calculated. You're in danger. The men hesitated. Something in her tone made them stop. I think you should listen to her, Jonathan said, his voice steady now. Emily stepped back, her sharp eyes never leaving the men. There was more to her than met the eye, and they would soon learn that. The energy in the room shifted once more, and this time, it was in her favor. The room remained still, the tension palpable in the air. Jonathan Hayes stood there, slightly stunned, his gaze still fixed on Emily Parker. She wasn't just the waitress anymore. Her calm, authoritative voice had cut through the chaos like a sharp blade, and the 4 men surrounding him seemed to hesitate, unsure of what to do next. The world seemed to slow down around them, but Emily was already several steps ahead. Her eyes flicked to the man who had shoved Jonathan earlier, analyzing him with the precision of someone who had seen danger before. She had been trained to read people, to sense when something was off. And this wasn't just a disagreement. It was something more. Jonathan was still recovering from the shock of the sudden attack, his chest rising and falling with each breath. But the moment he locked eyes with Emily, something clicked inside him. He didn't know who she was or what exactly she had been trained to do, but he instinctively trusted her. The group of men was still silent, their posture tense. as if they were trying to figure out what this unexpected interruption meant. Emily, however, was unfazed. She moved with an elegance that belied the gravity of the situation. She stepped forward, her heels clicking lightly against the marble floor, her movements deliberate and confident. Without a word, she placed herself between Jonathan and the group, her back straight and her stance firm. "You don't want to do this," Emily said, her voice low but filled with authority. The man who had shoved Jonathan was about to speak, but Emily silenced him with a single, calm gesture. Her eyes were unblinking, focused on him with an intensity that made him hesitate. Jonathan, still standing, watched her every move, something stirring inside him. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, but Emily didn't flinch. She was the calm in the storm. "You think you're in control," she continued, her eyes now shifting to each man in turn. "But you're not." The words hung in the air, weighty and certain. Jonathan, still processing everything that had just happened, felt something within him shift. He wasn't used to feeling vulnerable. But in this moment, he wasn't the one holding the power. Emily was. The men exchanged glances, their expressions uncertain. Emily's cool demeanor was clearly having an effect. Jonathan couldn't help but wonder who this woman really was. She wasn't like any waitress he had ever met. But before he could ask, the unexpected happened. One of the men, clearly the leader of the group, stepped forward. He was tall, well-dressed, with a sharp jawline and a look of arrogance that screamed wealth and privilege. He stared down at Emily, his lips curling into a smirk. "What makes you think you can stop us?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. Emily didn't even flinch. She didn't need to answer immediately. Instead, she raised an eyebrow, her gaze unwavering. "I don't need to stop you," she said quietly. "I just need to make sure you don't make a bigger mistake." The man's smirk faltered, just for a moment, as if Emily's words had hit a nerve. But then, he recovered, a cold laugh escaping his lips. "And what would you do to stop me?" he sneered. Emily's eyes narrowed, her posture still unyielding. "I wouldn't have to," she said simply, her voice steady and calm. The group of men stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. They had underestimated her, and now they were realizing it. Jonathan's mind raced. Who was this woman? Why was she so calm in the face of all this? And how was she managing to maintain control when it seemed like everything was spiraling out of control? Just then, Emily spoke again, her voice carrying an edge of finality. "Leave. Now." The command was sharp, but not shouted. It wasn't a plea. It was an order. And for the first time that night, the men hesitated. Jonathan watched as the leader of the group exchanged another look with his companions. Then, as if reading the atmosphere, he nodded curtly. Without another word, the group turned and made their way toward the door. Jonathan's heart was still pounding, but as the men left the restaurant, the tension seemed to dissolve with them. The air felt lighter, and Jonathan could finally breathe again. But Emily wasn't done yet. As the last man exited, she turned to Jonathan, her gaze now softening ever so slightly. "Are you all right, Mr. Hayes?" she asked, her voice no longer cold or commanding, but warm and concerned. Jonathan blinked, momentarily taken aback by her sudden shift in tone. He opened his mouth to speak, but found himself at a loss for words. Finally, after a beat, he managed a small nod. I'm fine. Thanks to you." Emily gave a small smile, but it was brief. She didn't want praise or recognition. She had done what needed to be done, and now she was ready to move on. Without another word, she turned and walked back toward the kitchen, leaving Jonathan standing there in the midst of the now quiet restaurant, his mind still racing with everything that had just happened. Jonathan Hayes sat back down, still processing what had just happened. The shock of being attacked in his own comfort zone, the dining room of one of the city's most prestigious restaurants, had left him reeling. But what shocked him more was Emily, the waitress. She wasn't just a server. He had expected someone meek, someone who would cower under pressure, but instead, he had witnessed someone who was calm, composed, and commanding. She had taken control of a situation that he, the millionaire CEO, couldn't. As he sat there, the noise of the restaurant slowly returned, though it felt muffled, distant. The clink of silverware and the low hum of conversation seemed to swirl around him, but he was lost in thought. Who was Emily? What kind of person was she? The calm with which she had handled the entire situation made him question everything he thought he knew about people. Jonathan had spent years in high-powered meetings, making deals with some of the most influential people in the world, yet no one had ever spoken to him like she had. No one had ever commanded his attention the way she had, without saying a word. He stood up, scanning the room for a moment, his eyes lingering on the spot where Emily had been just moments ago. She had returned to the kitchen, her back straight and her movements graceful. She wasn't a hero in a traditional sense, but in that moment, she had done what he couldn't. She had saved him without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. Jonathan moved to the bar, his mind still spinning. He ordered another drink, though the glass in front of him from before had barely been touched. His thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of everything. It was as if Emily had cracked open a door in his mind, and now, everything was flooding in. He took a long sip of his drink, his eyes still scanning the room, waiting for her to come back. Minutes later, Emily reappeared. She was back to work, serving another table, her face neutral and focused. She moved with the same quiet efficiency as before, never drawing attention to herself, but Jonathan couldn't take his eyes off her. He saw her now, not just as a waitress, but as someone with depth, someone who wasn't just passing through life, but someone who had lived through something that had shaped her into the person she was. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen something important in her, something he didn't fully understand yet. He had to know more. He couldn't let it go. Jonathan left his seat, moving towards the back of the restaurant. His steps were determined now, not with the usual self-assured confidence, but with a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. He reached the kitchen door just as Emily was walking out, balancing a tray of drinks. She saw him, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice as calm as ever. "Is everything all right? I need to talk to you," Jonathan said, his voice low but urgent. Emily hesitated for just a second, as if weighing the situation, but then nodded. "Of course," she replied, setting the tray down. "Is there somewhere we can talk?" Jonathan asked. Emily motioned toward a small office in the back of the restaurant. "We can talk in here," she said. As they entered the small room, Jonathan closed the door behind him. He wasn't sure what to say, but he knew he had to find out more about her. "I'm sorry if I startled you," he began, his usual confidence faltering for the first time that night. Emily looked at him, her eyes steady. "You didn't startle me," she replied. "But you do seem different." Jonathan paused, unsure how to respond. She was right. He did feel different. He felt like he was seeing the world through a new lens. "What made you do that?" he asked, finally finding the question he had been searching for. "What made you step in and save me?" Emily took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his. "Because I saw what you didn't," she said simply. "I saw what was about to happen, and I wasn't going to let it." Jonathan's mind raced. What did she mean? How did she know? "How did you know?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emily's expression softened. "Because I've been in situations like that before," she replied. "I've seen things others don't see. And sometimes, it's up to people like me to do something before it's too late." Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. He had to know more. "I don't understand," he admitted. Emily smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "You don't have to," she said softly. "You just have to trust that I did what needed to be done." Jonathan stood there, his mind swirling. There was so much he didn't understand, but he knew one thing for certain. His life had just changed, and Emily Parker had something to do with it. Jonathan stood there, his mind still reeling from everything that had just transpired. Emily's calm, yet firm demeanor had left him both confused and impressed. She was different from anyone he had ever met. A waitress, yes, but so much more than that. She had handled the situation with a level of control and insight that was beyond anything he had expected. As they sat in the small office, the tension between them shifted. Emily had answered his questions with an air of mystery, yet her eyes held something, an unspoken depth that made Jonathan want to know more. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of life she had lived before this. Why had she left it all behind to serve in a restaurant like this? There had to be a story, a reason. He leaned against the desk, trying to gather his thoughts, trying to process the whirlwind of events that had unfolded in such a short amount of time. "You saved me tonight," Jonathan said quietly, his voice tinged with gratitude. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Emily didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. The silence between them was comfortable, but there was an underlying tension. "I've seen things before," she said after a moment, her voice soft but resolute. Things most people never have to see. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. What did she mean by that? What kind of things had she experienced? You said you've been in situations like that before, he said, his curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Emily's gaze shifted, and for a brief moment, Jonathan thought he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. A shadow, perhaps, but just as quickly, it was gone. I used to do things that required a different set of skills, she replied, her voice distant, almost as if she were talking about someone else. Jonathan wasn't sure what she meant, but it was clear that her past was far from ordinary. There was a part of her that she was keeping hidden. He had seen it in the way she had moved, the way she had spoken to the men earlier. She wasn't just a waitress. She was someone who had lived a life that most people could never imagine. What happened? Jonathan asked, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. Emily took a deep breath, her eyes momentarily closing as if searching for the right words. Life happened, she said quietly. And sometimes, you make choices that change everything. Jonathan stood up, walking over to the window. The city lights twinkled below, a reminder of the world he controlled, the empire he had built. But in this small room, in this moment, everything felt different. He wasn't in control anymore. Emily had turned everything upside down, and he was no longer sure of what was real and what wasn't. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of this, Jonathan confessed, his voice low. I didn't expect to be in this situation. You saved my life tonight, and I can't just ignore that. Emily watched him, her gaze steady. You don't have to do anything, she replied softly. Sometimes, things happen, and you just have to let them. Jonathan turned to face her, his mind still spinning. He had always been in control, always had a plan. But tonight, nothing had gone as expected. Emily was right. Sometimes things happened that couldn't be explained, and this was one of those times. You're not like anyone I've ever met, Jonathan said, his voice filled with both admiration and confusion. Emily smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. No one ever is. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if they both understood something without having to say it aloud. Jonathan had met many people in his life, but none of them had made him feel like this. None of them had left him questioning everything he thought he knew. I need to know more about you, Jonathan said, his words coming out before he could stop them. Emily's expression didn't change, but her eyes softened. You don't need to know anything about me, she replied quietly. I'm just someone who did what had to be done. Jonathan shook his head, his mind still whirling. But that's just it, he said. I don't think you're just someone. There's more to you than that, and I need to understand it. Emily didn't say anything for a moment. She simply looked at him, her gaze steady, almost as if she were measuring him. It's not important, she said finally. What matters is that you're safe. And that's all you need to know. Jonathan wanted to argue, wanted to press her for more answers, but something in her voice stopped him. She wasn't going to open up about her past, not now. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't need to know. What mattered was that she had saved him. And in that moment, that was enough. Jonathan walked back to his table, the weight of the evening pressing down on him. He hadn't expected to feel so unsettled. Everything about the night had been off. The tension, the surprise attack, and most of all, Emily. She had saved his life, yet there was a part of him that still couldn't quite grasp it. He had been in control for so long, and now, in just a few hours, his world had been turned upside down. Jonathan sat down, trying to return to his usual calm, but something inside him was different. His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, seeing the name of his assistant, Mark. He almost didn't want to pick it up. He was used to making decisions, running his empire, but tonight felt like something else entirely. Still, he answered. Jonathan, I've got the update on the meeting with the investors. We need to finalize the terms. Jonathan sighed, feeling the pull of business even in this strange moment. I'll deal with it in the morning, Mark. Let's call it a night for now. Got it. But you know, we've got a lot riding on this deal. Jonathan rubbed his forehead. We'll handle it. Just give me a few hours. He hung up and sat back, letting the silence settle around him again. As the restaurant buzzed with the sounds of clinking glasses and quiet laughter, Jonathan felt alone in a way he hadn't before. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew he couldn't go back to the way things were. Emily had done something to him, something he couldn't put into words. She had shown him that the world wasn't always what it seemed. It wasn't all about power, wealth, and control. Sometimes, it was about doing what needed to be done, no matter the cost. And that thought lingered with him, gnawing at his mind. He looked over at the kitchen door where Emily had disappeared moments before. He had to know more. Jonathan didn't typically go after people. He was the one people came to. But something about her had caught his attention, and now he couldn't shake it. He had to understand her story. He stood up and walked to the kitchen door. This time, he didn't hesitate. He knocked lightly and pushed it open. Emily looked up, her back still turned as she was wiping down some utensils. When she saw him, she didn't seem surprised, just calm as usual. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone still as steady as ever. "Can I help you?" Jonathan felt a wave of uncertainty, but he pushed it aside. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Emily set down the rag and walked toward him. She had a way of moving, almost like a dancer, each step deliberate and graceful. "What is it?" she asked, her eyes not challenging, but curious. Jonathan glanced at the rest of the staff, who were busy with their own tasks. "In private," he said softly. Emily nodded, and without another word, she led him to a small storage room in the back. The room was dimly lit, shelves lined with cleaning supplies and unused equipment. She shut the door behind them, and for the first time that night, Jonathan felt the weight of the moment. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, but this was something he couldn't ignore. "What's going on, Mr. Hayes?" Emily asked, her tone still even, but with a hint of something. Maybe curiosity, maybe concern. Jonathan hesitated for a moment before speaking. "You saved my life tonight. I owe you more than thanks." Emily raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything. She wasn't looking for gratitude. She was looking for something else. "You're not just a waitress, are you?" Jonathan asked, his voice soft. She smiled faintly. "I'm just a person doing a job," she replied, but the words didn't seem to match the gravity in her eyes. Jonathan took a step closer. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I don't think that's all there is to you. You've got something more." Emily didn't respond immediately. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable. Jonathan felt himself growing impatient. "What happened to you?" he asked. "What is your story?" She exhaled slowly, the weight of his question hanging in the air. "It's not something I talk about," she said finally. "Why not?" Jonathan asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Emily's gaze softened, and for the first time, she looked vulnerable. "Because some things are better left in the past," she replied quietly. "Things that, if you really knew, would make you see me differently." Jonathan paused. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that, but he couldn't walk away now. "You've already shown me enough," he said gently. "I just want to understand." Emily sighed. "Maybe one day, I'll tell you." Jonathan nodded, not pushing her further. He had learned a lot from her already. He had learned that power wasn't everything, that sometimes strength came in quiet, unexpected ways. And that was something he would carry with him forever. Jonathan left the small storage room, his mind still grappling with everything Emily had said. The conversation had left him with more questions than answers, but in a way, it had also given him something he hadn't realized he was missing: clarity. He had come into this night expecting nothing more than a routine business dinner, but he was leaving with the understanding that his life had just been altered in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. As he returned to the main dining area, he couldn't shake the feeling that his perception of everything was shifting. He had always thought power was the key to everything, but now, he wasn't so sure. Emily had shown him a different kind of strength, one that wasn't about wealth or influence, but about quiet resolve and the ability to make the right choices in the face of uncertainty. Jonathan sat back down at his table, trying to return to the business at hand. His phone buzzed again, a reminder that the world he had left behind was still waiting for his attention. He glanced at the screen and saw that it was another message from Mark, his assistant. He debated ignoring it, but he knew he couldn't. The deal was important. It had to be finalized. He tapped the message open, reading quickly. "Jonathan, we need to make the final call on the investment. Are we moving forward with this?" Jonathan exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure if he could make any more decisions tonight, but he knew what he had to do. He typed a quick response, telling Mark to handle it for now. It wasn't that he didn't care about the deal. It was that he realized, for the first time, that some things were more important than business. Jonathan put his phone down and looked around the restaurant. The evening had taken on an entirely new feel. The usual hum of conversation and clinking glasses seemed distant now, as if he were hearing it from far away. His thoughts kept drifting back to Emily. There was something about her. Something about the way she carried herself, the way she stepped in without hesitation when everything had seemed to spiral out of control. It wasn't just that she had saved him, it was that she had done so in a way that made him rethink his entire approach to life. He had always admired people who could control situations, who had the power to make things go their way. But now, he wasn't so sure if that was the only kind of strength there was. Maybe there was a different kind of power, the kind that wasn't about taking control, but about knowing when to let go. As Jonathan sat there, lost in thought, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around, expecting one of the staff members, but instead, it was Emily. She had returned, a calm presence once again in the chaos of the evening. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone polite but casual. "I just wanted to make sure everything is okay." Jonathan looked at her, trying to read her expression. There was no judgment in her eyes, no expectation, just a quiet understanding. For the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt seen in a way he hadn't before. "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "Thank you for everything." Emily nodded, her smile lingering for a moment. "You're welcome." She hesitated for a second before speaking again. "If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." Jonathan nodded, but before he could respond, she was gone, slipping back into the rhythm of the restaurant. As he watched her disappear, he realized something. He wasn't just thinking about the deal anymore. He wasn't even thinking about the business empire he had built. He was thinking about Emily, and the way she had changed everything. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, the weight of the night settling in. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The path he had been walking, the one defined by success and control, was no longer the only one that mattered. There was a new road ahead, one that he hadn't seen before. And it was a road he was finally ready to walk down. The night was still young, but for Jonathan Hayes, everything had already changed. Jonathan spent the next few days in a daze. He couldn't stop thinking about the encounter with Emily. The way she had handled the situation, the quiet confidence she exuded, had left a lasting impression on him. His mind kept drifting back to her words, the way she had explained that sometimes strength wasn't about control, but knowing when to let go. It was a perspective he had never considered. He had built his empire on control, on the ability to shape his destiny and make things happen. But Emily had shown him a different kind of power. It wasn't flashy or demanding. It was subtle, quiet, and deeply effective. She had saved him in a way that he couldn't even explain, and that thought haunted him. He couldn't help but wonder about her past, about what had shaped her into the woman she was today. He had tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing instead on his business, but it was impossible. Every time he tried to refocus, his mind returned to her. On the fourth day after the incident, Jonathan found himself standing in front of the same restaurant where everything had changed. He hadn't planned to come back, but something about the place called to him. Maybe it was the desire for answers. Maybe it was the need to understand. As he stepped inside, the familiar sounds of clinking glasses and soft chatter surrounded him. It was still early, so the restaurant was only half full. He looked around, trying to find a seat, but his eyes immediately went to the back, to the kitchen door where Emily had disappeared that night. Without thinking, he walked toward it. He was aware of the curiosity in the eyes of the staff as he made his way through the restaurant, but he didn't care. He needed to see her. When he reached the kitchen door, he paused. He wasn't sure what he was going to say or how this would go, but he couldn't leave without at least trying. He knocked lightly, then pushed the door open. Emily was standing at the counter, talking to a fellow server, but when she saw Jonathan, her conversation stopped. She looked at him for a moment, her expression unreadable, but then she nodded toward the back. "Come in," she said quietly, almost as if she had been expecting him. Jonathan stepped inside, feeling the weight of the moment. The kitchen was small but efficient, a stark contrast to the lavish dining room he was used to. "Mr. Hayes," Emily said, her voice calm as always. "I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon." Jonathan looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, "and I realize now that I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of this." Emily raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. Jonathan took a deep breath, trying to find the words. You changed something in me, he said finally. I'm not sure how or why, but I can't stop thinking about it. Emily studied him for a moment before responding. Sometimes, things happen that we don't understand, she said softly. But that doesn't mean they don't have a purpose. Jonathan nodded, taking in her words. There was so much he didn't understand, but he knew that this moment, this encounter, was important. He had never felt this way before, and it was both unsettling and liberating. I want to learn more about you, he said, his voice steady now. I want to understand who you really are. Emily's expression softened, but there was still a trace of hesitation in her eyes. You don't need to, she replied, her voice gentle but firm. I'm just someone doing my job. You don't have to try to fix it. Jonathan shook his head. It's not about fixing it, he said, his tone sincere. I just want to know the truth. Emily didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at him, her gaze lingering for a moment before she finally spoke. The truth, she said slowly, is that sometimes people make decisions that take them down paths they didn't expect. And sometimes, those decisions lead to things that can't be undone. Jonathan listened closely, trying to understand, but there was something about her words that seemed both distant and personal at the same time. I'm not asking you to explain everything, he said, his voice softer now. I just want to understand you. Who you are, what drives you. Emily paused, her gaze shifting slightly. I'm just trying to live my life, she said quietly. The past is behind me, and I don't look back. It's the only way I can move forward. Jonathan nodded, finally understanding that Emily wasn't someone who needed saving. She wasn't waiting for anyone to fix her or offer her a better life. She had already taken control of her own destiny, in a way that no one could take away from her. Thank you, he said simply, his voice filled with gratitude. Emily gave him a small nod. You're welcome. As Jonathan turned to leave, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. He didn't need to understand everything about her. He just needed to accept her for who she was. And in that moment, he realized that this experience had changed him in a way that nothing else could. He had come here searching for answers, but what he had found was something more valuable than any answer could be, a deeper understanding of himself, and the realization that sometimes strength wasn't about control. It was about knowing when to let go. Jonathan spent the next few days in deep reflection, still processing everything that had happened. His meetings, his phone calls, and his usual life all seemed distant, as if they belonged to someone else. Emily's words, her calmness, her unyielding strength, had shifted something inside him. He could no longer see the world through the same lens. The power he had once relied on, the power of control, money, and influence, felt hollow compared to the quiet power Emily had shown him. He had spent so many years fighting for dominance, but now, after meeting her, he questioned whether that was the right approach. It wasn't that he had regrets about his career or his success. It was more about realizing there was another way. Emily had lived a life that demanded respect not through force, but through wisdom and grace. It was a humbling thought. Jonathan knew he needed to understand her better, but he also knew that this wasn't something to rush. He had learned the hard way that the most important lessons in life often came when you least expected them. That night, as he walked through the city streets, the cool breeze on his face helped clear his mind. He hadn't planned on walking through the streets of Manhattan, but there was something calming about the night air. The lights of the city, the constant hum of life around him, it all felt like a reminder that the world continued to move, regardless of the chaos in his own life. Jonathan found himself standing outside the restaurant again, the very place where everything had shifted. He hadn't intended to come back so soon, but as he stood there, he realized that this was where he needed to be. Emily had opened his eyes to something more, something deeper than business and deals. He entered the restaurant, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. The hostess greeted him, and he asked if Emily was working that night. She nodded and pointed toward the back. Jonathan's steps were measured as he walked through the restaurant, his eyes scanning the room. He had never felt so out of place in such a familiar environment. When he reached the back, he saw her immediately. Emily was at the bar, casually chatting with a regular customer, her smile easy and genuine. She didn't seem to notice him at first, but when she did, she raised an eyebrow in surprise. Mr. Hayes, she said, her voice calm as ever. Back so soon. Jonathan hesitated for a moment before responding. I needed to see you, he said simply. Emily gave a small nod, her eyes studying him closely. Everything all right? She asked, her tone a mix of concern and curiosity. Jonathan felt a shift in the air, a quiet understanding between them. I've been thinking about what you said, he began. About power, about control. And I've realized I've been going about things all wrong. Emily didn't say anything at first. She simply waited, her expression unreadable but not unfriendly. Jonathan continued. I've spent so many years believing that power was about controlling everything around me. But now I'm not so sure. You showed me that there's another way. A way that doesn't require force or dominance, but wisdom and humility. Emily looked at him for a long moment before speaking. That's a hard lesson to learn, she said quietly. But it's one that can change everything if you're ready to accept it. Jonathan nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. I think I'm ready, he said, his voice steady. I want to learn more. Not just about business, but about life. About how to be a better person. A better leader. Emily gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. It's a journey, she said softly. One step at a time. Jonathan stood there for a moment, taking in the quietness of the exchange. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known before. He wasn't sure if he would ever fully understand Emily's past, but in that moment, he didn't need to. What mattered was that he had learned something important, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The city outside was still buzzing, still moving, but Jonathan Hayes felt like he was standing still, in a good way. He had been given a new perspective, and he was ready to face whatever came next, one step at a time. Jonathan spent the next few weeks reflecting on everything that had changed. He had always prided himself on being in control, but meeting Emily had challenged everything he thought he knew about power, leadership, and success. He had learned a lot in a short amount of time. His business was still important to him, but now, it felt like there was something more, something he had been missing all along. He couldn't help but think about the conversation they'd had in the small back room of the restaurant. She had spoken with such quiet wisdom, and it resonated with him. He had spent his life building a career, surrounding himself with people who admired him for his wealth and influence. But Emily had shown him that true strength came not from controlling others, but from understanding oneself and knowing when to step back. It was a lesson he hadn't known he needed, but now, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was the key to something bigger. As the days passed, Jonathan found himself making small changes. He was more patient in meetings, more aware of the people around him. He started asking questions instead of making demands, listening more instead of speaking first. He didn't expect overnight transformation, but he could feel the shift in himself, and it felt good. One afternoon, Jonathan decided to return to the restaurant. It had become a symbol of the change he was going through, the place where everything had started. He walked inside with a sense of purpose, his footsteps steady but not hurried. Emily was working that night, moving effortlessly between tables, her calm presence filling the space. She didn't notice him at first, but when she did, she gave him a small, acknowledging smile. Mr. Hayes, she said, her voice calm as always. Back again. Jonathan smiled, a rare, genuine smile. I've been thinking, he began, about everything you said. I'm trying to be better, to do things differently. Emily raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable but not unkind. And how's that going? She asked, her tone gentle. Jonathan's smile widened slightly. Better than I expected, he said. But it's a work in progress. Emily nodded, her eyes softening. That's all any of us can do, she replied. Jonathan felt a sense of connection in that moment, a sense of understanding between them. I wanted to thank you, he said sincerely, for showing me a different way to think. I don't know if I would have figured it out on my own. Emily shrugged slightly, as if the words didn't need to be said. I didn't do anything, she said simply. You did the work. Jonathan chuckled softly, feeling the weight of the truth in her words. I guess so. There was a pause, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared moment of quiet recognition. Jonathan didn't need to say anything more. He had learned from her, and now he was on his own path. I'll let you get back to work, he said after a moment. But I wanted to say thank you again. For everything. Emily smiled softly, a flicker of warmth in her eyes. You're welcome, she said, her voice light but sincere. Jonathan turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he glanced back at her. He couldn't help but feel that their paths had crossed for a reason. that this was just the beginning of something new for him. As he stepped out into the crisp evening air, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. The city seemed different somehow, as if it were full of new possibilities. Jonathan wasn't sure what the future held, but, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally ready to face it. He had the power to change, and that, he realized, was more than enough.